The chandeliers glowed like captured constellations, spilling light across marble floors polished so clean they seemed to swallow reflections whole. Violins carried their song through the ballroom air, sweet and sharp, weaving between the laughter of men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns shimmering like rivers of silk. Champagne flutes clinked as fortunes were toasted and promises exchanged, though none of them were real promises, only the kind gilded with profit and politics. Beneath the laughter, there was a hollowness, a sound that rang like an echo trapped inside a cavern. Jonathan Remington had walked into this ballroom hundreds of times in his life, but tonight he hadn't come for the show. He hadn't come for the handshakes, the staged photographs, or the polite lies exchanged beneath crystal chandeliers. He had come only to deliver his check, sign his name to a ledger that mattered less to him than the pen he signed it with, and vanish before anyone could corner him with conversation. His overcoat was still on, collar turned up against the December air outside. His driver was waiting, the engine idling, the city ready to swallow him whole again. He was a man who had everything and felt none of it. His empire stretched across continents, real estate, technology, stocks rising like tides, and yet his chest was a vault filled with dust. His assistants whispered about his brilliance, his rivals about his coldness. He had taught himself never to linger, never to pause long enough to notice what his money could not buy. Tonight was no different, until it was. He had already turned toward the side exit, a quiet corner that would spare him the clamor of farewells, when he heard it, a voice, so small it should have been lost under the music, but instead it pierced the space between heartbeats. "Can I have just one dance?" Jonathan stopped mid-step. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, some child's whisper bleeding in from the hall. But then he turned his head, and the sight caught him harder than the voice. Just beyond the reach of the golden light, where the ballroom's glow spilled into the garden, stood a girl. She was no guest's daughter, not one of the polished children. In satin bows or patent shoes, her white dress was torn at the hem, stitched back together with uneven thread, mismatched fabric pulling it into shape like a secret patched together in haste. Her shoes didn't match, one scuffed black, one faded brown. She clutched the iron railing of the garden steps as if the earth might open beneath her. If she let go, her hair was tied with thread instead of ribbon, and her eyes, those were the worst, or maybe the best eyes that should have sparkled with mischief or wonder at her age, but instead carried weight, as if she had already seen too many doors close. Too many hands refused to reach back. Jonathan felt his breath falter, his body stilled by something he couldn't yet name. It wasn't pity that froze him. It was recognition, though of what? He couldn't say. The girl looked at him, not with fear, not with expectation, but with the kind of fragile hope that had already been bruised too many times. To stand tall on its own, the violin soared inside. Laughter erupted with another toast, and no one looked outside. No one but him. She lifted her chin, just slightly, as though dignity was something she had been taught to carry no matter the cracks in her dress. And then she asked again, softer, but still steady, "Can I have just one dance?" The words did not belong in a night like this. They didn't belong to a child standing in the shadows of a glittering world that had no space for her. Yet they rooted him to the stone path. A question so simple that it shattered him in a way fortunes never could. He should have turned away. He should have walked back to the waiting car, the warm leather seats, the insulated life that had protected him from such intrusions for years. But he didn't. He couldn't. Jonathan Remington, man of power, man of Wall, stood silent under the gaze of a little girl in a torn dress, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. And in that silence, in the fragile breath between the music inside and the night air outside, a seed of something dangerous began to take root. Suspense, mystery, a sense that nothing about his life, or hers, would remain untouched after this one request. Just one dance. Asterisk, the night air clung colder now, as if the moment itself had shifted the temperature. Jonathan stood as if someone had frozen him in place, the girl's question echoing in his ears louder than the violin crescendos spilling out from the ballroom. A simple request, yes, but it carried a weight that clawed straight through his guarded exterior. "Can I have just one dance?" Those words weren't polite. They weren't sweet. They were a plea wrapped in pride, a child's hope disguised as courage. He stepped forward once, uncertain, his leather shoes crunching against the gravel path. His instincts screamed at him to leave. He had done his part tonight, dropped his donation, played his role as benefactor in this glittering theater, but something about the girl's torn white dress stopped him. Not the tear itself, but the uneven stitching holding it together. It was the familiar. The thread ran clumsy, mismatched in tension, shaped into a crooked little heart at the corner of her hem. His chest tightened. He knew that stitch, years ago. Long before the world bowed to his last name, he had sat in a cramped apartment with a spool of thread between his fingers. A woman had laughed at his attempts, guiding his clumsy hands as he tried to mend a dress she swore she would keep forever. She had pressed her lips to his temple when he finally managed to shape an even, imperfect, but real. That patch was no accident. That patch belonged to him. Jonathan's heartbeat stumbled. He looked at the girl again, her hands gripping the railing as if she had been waiting all her life for someone to see her. The noise of the gala behind him dimmed, and all he could hear was her voice when she whispered, "They all have real dads in there. I know mine isn't coming, but Mommy said maybe someone kind might still pick me." The words sliced through him, his empire, his billions, his towers of steel and glass. All of it meant nothing against the raw honesty of that sentence. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask who she was, but the girl twirled suddenly, lifting her dress slightly, as if rehearsing the dance she had begged for. The past heart swung in the glow of the garden lights. Jonathan's legs weakened, and, for the first time in decades, he felt like falling. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, threatening to drag him into a truth he wasn't prepared to face. He gripped the railing for balance, his fingers trembling. The girl stopped twirling, and looked at him with furrowed brows. "Did I do it wrong?" she asked, her voice small, but steady, as if failure was something she was used to bracing for. Jonathan's throat closed. He dropped to one knee, not out of choice, but because his body refused to hold him upright any longer. His carefully pressed overcoat wrinkled against the cold stone, his hands pressing into the earth. People inside the ballroom turned their heads toward the glass windows, confused at the sight of a powerful man collapsing outside, but they didn't understand. Only the girl did. She bent down, her tiny arms circling his neck, her innocence holding together the pieces of his shattering world. "It's okay," she whispered against his ear. "I can pretend you're my dad for just one night." The words broke him. They didn't sound like make-believe. They sounded like prophecy. Jonathan's gaze fell back to the patch, to that crooked heart he once stitched as a younger man, and the storm inside him turned violent. Could it be? Was this child somehow connected to the woman who disappeared without a trace all those years ago? His mind burned with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Not yet. Not here. And then the girl tilted her head. Her eyes filled with a strange knowing, and hummed a tune. A melody soft and haunting, as fragile as a candle flame. His breath caught. It was a lullaby. Not just any lullaby, his lullaby. The secret one he used to sing when his palm rested on the curve of a belly carrying a future he never got to meet. The blood drained from his face. The music from the violins inside seemed to vanish, replaced by that soft hum. The world collapsed into this one moment. A girl in a torn dress, a crooked heart stitched at the hem, and a song that should not belong to her, but somehow did. Jonathan raised his trembling hand, not to touch her, but to steady himself. His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "Where did you get that dress?" The girl blinked up at him, unafraid. "Mommy gave it to me," she said softly. "She said it was special. She said someone gave it to her when she was carrying me." Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. His lungs burned as if they had forgotten how to breathe. He stared at her, every piece of his carefully constructed life trembling on the edge of collapse. The girl smiled faintly, tilting her head again. She said, "He never got to meet me. But he would have loved me if he had." The words stabbed through Jonathan's chest with merciless precision. His empire, his reputation, his polished existence, all of it felt meaningless in the presence of this truth. Blooming quietly in the night air, the girl's eyes softened. "Did I make you sad, mister?" Jonathan's lips parted, but no words came. He could only stare at her, at the hem of her dress, at the song still hanging between them, and feel the storm rising higher. Something was wrong. Very wrong, and yet, for the first time in years, Jonathan Remington felt something else something terrifying hope. The night seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan remained on one knee, his pulse hammering so violently it felt as though the world could hear it. The girl's hum still lingered in the air, dissolving into the shadows under the oak trees. That lullaby had no right to belong to her, and yet she carried it as if it were carved into her bones. He could no longer convince himself this was coincidence. The girl shifted slightly, pulling away just enough to study his face. "Do you know the song?" she asked, her voice quiet, as if afraid the ballroom behind them might steal the answer if spoken too loud. Jonathan's lips trembled. His throat felt raw, scraped with memories he had buried deep. "Yes," he whispered at last. "I used to sing it, a long time ago." Her eyes brightened, just a flicker. But even that flicker was more powerful than the golden chandeliers and polished marble behind him. "Mommy said maybe he still hums it too," she said, almost to herself. Maybe he still remembers. The words clawed through him. He tried to swallow, to force air into his lungs, but his chest refused. He wanted to demand answers, to demand who her mother was, but before he could form the question, the little girl reached into her tiny purse. It was nothing more than a frayed fabric pouch with a single button missing, but she treated it with such care that he leaned forward instinctively. She pulled out a piece of crumpled paper and smoothed it carefully against the railing, before holding it out to him. "I made this when I was 4, she said. "I'm 5 now." Jonathan's hand shook as he accepted it. His fingers were unsteady, the paper threatening to tear in his grip. When he opened it, he nearly lost his breath. It was a drawing childlike, scribbled in crayon, yet piercing in its clarity. A man with a briefcase, a woman in a yellow dress, a little girl. Between them, holding both their hands. The words scrawled beneath in uneven, almost broken letters. "My family. I hope I find them one day." Jonathan's vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the tears spilled anyway, tracing hot lines down his cheeks, his hand pressed against his mouth to muffle the sound, threatening to break from his chest. The world tilted again, heavier, crueler. The girl tilted her head, concerned. "Mister, are you crying?" He tried to answer, but the word caught in his throat. He shook his head, though it was a lie. He was unraveling, thread by thread, and this child, this stranger, was pulling every hidden string. She reached out and touched his cheek with the smallest hand, so gentle it nearly undid him completely. "It's okay if you are. Mommy says sometimes grown-ups get sad too." The touch seared him. A child, comforting him, when it should have been the other way around. He closed his eyes for a second, hearing only the faint hum of the violins, muffled by the ballroom walls and the fragile sound of her breathing. He forced himself to speak. "What's your name?" She smiled shyly. "Elsie." She paused, then added with a kind of pride that stabbed deeper, "Elsie Remington Hayes." Jonathan's blood turned to ice. The ground fell away from under him. Remington. His name. His name carried in this little girl's chest as if it had always belonged there. He felt as though lightning had split him open, leaving no place to hide. He staggered back a step, gripping the railing for balance, his knuckles white. What did you say?" His voice broke. "Elsie Remington Hayes," she repeated simply. She looked at him with curiosity. "Mommy said Remington is special. She said it was his name too." Jonathan couldn't breathe. Every wall he had built, every defense, every mask obliterated in one heartbeat. He felt the weight of years crash down upon him, years of unanswered questions, of letters that never came, of silence where love once lived. He swallowed hard, but his voice was barely a rasp when he forced the question out. "Elsie, what's your mommy's name?" The girl hesitated, frowning, almost as if she had been told not to tell strangers. She clutched her little purse close again, biting her lip. "She said I shouldn't tell strangers her name." Jonathan lowered himself to his knees again, but this time not out of weakness, out of desperation. He placed his trembling hand gently over hers. "You're right," he whispered. "You're so smart to listen. But just this once, please. I need to know." Elsie studied him with the seriousness of a child who had already learned how to read souls. Her gaze seemed to reach through every carefully polished mask he had ever worn. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice no louder than a secret. "Her name is Evelyn." The sound shattered him. He had been waiting, dreading, needing that name for 5 years. Only one Evelyn had vanished from his world without a note, without a goodbye, leaving him broken. Only one Evelyn had once danced with him in a yellow dress under cheap string lights, swearing she would never let go. Jonathan's knees buckled, his body trembling under the crushing truth. His chest heaved, and for the first time in years, he whispered aloud, broken and trembling, "My God, she's mine." But he wasn't ready for what came next. The girl pulled out one last item from her purse, folded and worn from too many hands. A card, a hospital's name, a room number, a time scrawled in pencil. She held it out, her eyes wide, her voice fragile. "Mommy's sick, really sick." She said, "If anything happens, I should find you." I wanted it to be a surprise. Jonathan stared at the card as though it were a death sentence. The cold of the December night seeped into his bones, but inside him burned a storm so fierce it nearly ripped him apart. He clutched the card with trembling hands, pulled Elsie against his chest, and held her tight. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This was fate dragging him back into the past he had tried to bury. And for the first time in decades, the unshakable Jonathan Remington Millionaire CEO, master of empires, broke completely, because he wasn't just holding a little girl. He was holding his daughter. Asterisk, the ride to the hospital blurred like a fevered dream. Jonathan sat in the back of his black town car, Elsie beside him, her small hand gripping his sleeve with a trust that both warmed and shattered him. Outside, the city lights streaked across the windows, neon signs, flashing headlights, shadows of pedestrians huddled against the winter air, but Jonathan saw none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the card in his hand, the one that trembled like a verdict. St. Catherine's Hospital, room 217. A single room number that threatened to unravel every carefully stacked piece of his empire. Elsie hummed softly beside him, that same lullaby, her head leaning against his arm. He glanced down at her, at the rise and fall of her chest as her eyelids fluttered closed. She looked peaceful, as if tonight had given her something she had been waiting for all her life. For Jonathan, however, peace was impossible. The storm inside him had turned violent rage at the years stolen, grief at the love he had lost, guilt that gnawed like a predator. Evelyn, her name alone still had the power to cut him open. And now she was here, alive, but fading, waiting. When the car pulled up in front of the hospital, Jonathan didn't move at first. He stared at the glowing red letters above the entrance as though they marked not a building, but a battlefield. His chest rose and fell sharply, his breath uneven. For a man who had signed billion-dollar deals without flinching, whose rivals had crumbled under the weight of his gaze, this was the first time he felt truly powerless. He gathered Elsie gently into his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, her tiny fingers clutching his overcoat as if afraid he might vanish. He carried her through the sliding glass doors, the sterile smell of antiseptic washing over him instantly. Nurses bustled past, ivy poles rattled against the floor. Voices murmured in hushed tones of illness and survival. This was not a place where reunions belonged, and yet it was where his life was about to be rewritten. Room 217. He stopped outside the door, his palms slick, his throat dry. The number glared at him like a sentence carved into stone. His heart pounded so loud he was certain the nurses passing could hear it. He knocked once, softly, afraid the sound itself might break her. A nurse opened the door, eyes widening as she recognized him, though she said nothing. "She's been asking for her daughter," the nurse whispered. "Is that—" "Yes," Jonathan rasped, his voice catching. "It's her." The nurse stepped aside, and Jonathan crossed the threshold into the room. Time fractured. There she was, Evelyn, pale against the white sheets, her hair thinner now, her skin fragile, but her presence unchanged, even weakened. She radiated the same quiet strength that had once undone him. The sight nearly drove him to his knees again. He set Elsie gently in a chair beside the bed, and only then did Evelyn's eyes flicker open. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. She simply stared at him, her chest rising in shallow breaths, as though she wasn't sure he was real. Then her lips parted, her voice hoarse but certain. "You found me." Asterisk, Jonathan's throat burned. He shook his head slowly, fighting the wave threatening to pull him under. "No," he whispered. "I found her first." He gestured toward the child now stirring awake, her eyes fluttering as she reached instinctively for her mother's hand. Evelyn looked down at her daughter, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. She turned back to Jonathan, her voice breaking on a single sentence. "She looks like you." The words crushed him. He took a faltering step forward, then stopped, his guilt heavier than his feet. He wanted to take Evelyn's hand, to close the years between them, but hesitation chained him. "Why did you leave?" His voice cracked, filled with a hurt so old it sounded new. Her eyes closed for a moment, as though the answer itself carried too much weight. When she opened them again, pain shone brighter than illness. "Because I saw you falling apart. You were drowning in ambition, drowning in yourself. I didn't want her to grow up watching you destroy yourself." Jonathan shook his head violently, anger and grief twisting together. I would have fought for her. I would have. No. Evelyn cut him off gently, but with a finality that stung deeper than any shout. You didn't even fight for yourself. How could you fight for us? Silence descended, thick and suffocating. The machines beeped steadily, the fur line dripped, and in the space between them, 5 years of absence screamed louder than words. Elsie stirred, her small voice breaking the stillness. Mommy, I found him. Evelyn's face softened. She stroked her daughter's hair with trembling fingers, whispering, you did so good, baby. Elsie smiled, her eyes closing again as if content, while Jonathan stood frozen by the window, his hands gripping the sill until his knuckles whitened. He stared into the night sky, into the city he had conquered but never truly lived in, and felt hollowed out. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a thread. How bad is it, Evelyn's? Eyes turned away, her silence sharper than truth. When she finally answered, it was no softer than a knife. It's spreading. They caught it too late. Jonathan's breath collapsed from his lungs. He turned back to her, his voice cracking with anguish. Why didn't you call me? Her eyes met his, weary but unwavering. Because I didn't want your pity. I didn't want her to see me beg. All I wanted was for her to have a chance to know you before I couldn't give it to her anymore. That broke him. He crossed the room, sat beside her bed, and this time he took her hand, not caring if he deserved it or not. His grip was firm, desperate, a man clutching not his skin, but at time itself. Let me be there now, he whispered fiercely. Let me give her what you gave up everything to protect. Evelyn's breath hitched. Tears slid down her cheeks. As her voice cracked, you'll take her. Jonathan shook his head, his own tears falling freely now. No, I'll choose her, every day, the way I should have from the beginning. Evelyn closed her eyes then, a long exhale slipping from her lips, as though she had been holding her breath for 5 years and finally let it go. For a while, neither spoke. The machines hummed softly, the lights dimmed, and between them lay a sleeping child, their child safe for the first time in her short life. But Jonathan knew the silence was temporary. He knew time was already against them, and as he sat there, clutching Evelyn's hand and staring at the fragile rise and fall of her chest, a single truth carved itself into his heart like stone. He had already lost her once. He could not lose her again, yet deep down, he feared that he already had. Asterisk, the days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythm of hospital machines and the faint hum of lullabies whispered. Between a mother and her daughter, Jonathan did not leave room 217. He conducted meetings in hushed tones from the armchair by the window, turned away board members who demanded his presence, and ignored headlines speculating on his disappearance from the business world. For once, none of it mattered. All that mattered was Evelyn, pale and fragile in the hospital bed, and Elsie, whose laughter was too rare and too precious to waste. But time was merciless. The doctor stopped speaking in months. They whispered in weeks. Evelyn's strength waned each day, her voice softer, her touch weaker, though her eyes those fierce, unyielding eyes remained sharp. One evening, as Jonathan sat by her side, Elsie climbed onto the bed and nestled against her mother's arm. Evelyn stroked her daughter's hair slowly, her lips trembling as though holding back words too heavy to speak. It was Elsie who broke the silence. Her tiny hand tugged at Jonathan's sleeve, her voice so soft he almost thought he imagined it. Before she goes, she whispered, I want her to see us dance. Jonathan froze, his heart hammered against his ribs, his mind stumbling over the request. Dance here, in a place of beeping monitors and hushed footsteps. Yet when he looked at Elsie, her eyes were clear, shining with something far older than her years. It wasn't just a child's wish. It was a plea, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He couldn't speak. He only nodded, his throat too tight for words. The next morning, Jonathan made a call, not to a board member, not to an investor, to the ballroom, the very same one where he had first seen Elsie standing in her torn white dress, where everything had changed. He rented it outright, cleared the guest list, ordered the chandeliers dimmed and the floor lit only by hundreds of soft yellow bulbs, strung from wall to wall. He didn't want grandeur. He wanted intimacy, a stage not for spectacle, but for closure. That evening, Jonathan entered Evelyn's hospital room with a garment bag slung over his shoulder. Evelyn looked at him curiously, her strength waning but her suspicion sharp. What are you doing? Jonathan smiled faintly, though. His hands trembled as he unzipped the bag. Inside was a white dress torn no longer. He had taken Elsie's patched gown and stitched it himself, carefully, awkwardly, the way he had once stitched a heart onto another dress long ago. Every uneven line of thread was his own. When Elsie saw it, her eyes widened, and she gasped. "You fixed it." "No," Jonathan said, kneeling so he could meet her gaze. "I didn't fix it. I made it whole." That night, with Evelyn bundled gently into the car, Jonathan carried her into the ballroom. She was weak, her body frail, but her eyes widened the moment she crossed the threshold. There were no crowds this time, no polished laughter or clinking glasses. Only soft golden light and silence broken by the tuning of a string quartet. The vast space was theirs alone. Evelyn pressed her hand to her lips, tears gathering instantly. "Jonathan, what did you do?" He steadied her carefully into a chair, then extended his hand toward Elsie, who now wore her mended dress. The child hesitated only a moment before placing her small hand in his. He led her to the center of the room, nodded to the quartet, and as the first notes of a single song filled the space, Elsie stepped onto his shoes again. Just as she had that first night under the oak trees, her tiny head rested against his chest. His hands, though trembling, steadied around her small frame. Slowly, carefully, they began to move. Every step was a confession. Every twirl a plea for forgiveness. The chandeliers above caught the tears shining in his eyes, turning them into stars. Elsie's patched dress swayed around her ankles, no longer a symbol of poverty, but of belonging. Evelyn watched, tears streaming freely down her face. She pressed a hand against her heart, her lips trembling as if whispering words only she could hear. Jonathan glanced toward her just once, and in her gaze he found both an ending and a beginning. The music swelled, and Elsie lifted her head, whispering, "You came back." Jonathan's voice cracked. "I never should have left." When the final note faded in the silence, Elsie twirled once more and stopped, breathless, her cheeks flushed. She looked toward her mother, her voice breaking but proud. "We did it, Mommy. He came back." Evelyn smiled through her tears, her chest rising weakly, but her spirit fierce. "You gave him a reason," she whispered. That night, back in room 217, Evelyn slipped away quietly, peacefully, her daughter's hand in one palm and Jonathan's in the other. No last speeches, no dramatic goodbyes, just the softest smile, the faintest breath. Like a candle flickering out at dawn, Jonathan held both hands long after they grew still. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a millionaire, or a CEO, or a man who had conquered empires. He felt like a boy again, broken, grieving, holding on to love with fingers too small to contain it. And yet, as he looked at Elsie curled into his chest, her breath steady even in sleep, Jonathan felt something else too, a promise. Not spoken, not written, but etched into his very blood. The dance wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jonathan woke the next morning to a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. The hospital room was dim. A thin strip of sunlight cutting across the bed where Evelyn had lain only hours before. The machines had been wheeled away. The blankets were folded neatly, almost cruelly neat, as if order could disguise the emptiness left behind. Elsie stirred in the armchair beside him, her patched dress wrinkled from sleep, her small body curled tight as if she knew without being told that her mother would not wake again. Jonathan sat motionless, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the sound of her soft breathing, clutching the memory of Evelyn's final smile. He had faced hostile boardrooms, lawsuits, betrayals, billion-dollar losses, but nothing had ever hollowed him like this. He wanted to break. He wanted to shatter into dust. But Elsie stirred again, whispered in her sleep, "Daddy," and suddenly he knew he couldn't. Not now, not ever. The days that followed tested him in ways he could never have imagined. Evelyn's funeral was quiet, humble, attended not by the glittering elites who filled his contact lists, but by nurses, neighbors, and a handful of people who had known her not as the woman who vanished, but as the mother who stayed. Jonathan stood at the back, holding Elsie's hand tightly as she clutched a wilted flower, her eyes wide but dry. He realized then that she had no tears left. Her grief had lived in her long before her mother's final breath. When the service ended, reporters swarmed the gates, hungry for scandal, for a headline that screamed "Millionaire CEO discovers secret daughter at lover's deathbed." Jonathan ignored them all. He shielded Elsie with his overcoat, lifted her into the car, and drove away from the cameras, from the whispers, from the empire waiting to consume him again. For the first time in years, he did not return to the skyscraper that bore his name. He returned instead to a house he had nearly forgotten, a quiet estate on the city's edge, where the walls echoed with nothing but absence. He walked through it with Elsie clinging to his hand, her mismatched shoes tapping softly against marble floors. Every room felt alien to her, too big, too empty. Jonathan saw it too, saw the hollowness of his empire reflected in the silence of his home. And in that silence, he made a decision. The next morning, his assistant arrived with papers stacked high, contracts requiring his signature, schedules mapped in hours, weeks, months. Jonathan looked at them once, then pushed them aside. "Cancel it all," he said flatly. "All, sir." The assistant stammered, stunned. "All," Jonathan repeated, his eyes never leaving the child at the breakfast table, struggling to balance a fork in her tiny hand. "The empire can wait. My daughter cannot." From that day, his life transformed. The man who once measured time in profits began to measure it in moments. He burned pancakes every Sunday morning, much to Elsie's delight. He learned how to braid hair, fumbling awkwardly at first until she giggled and guided his hands. He carried her backpack to kindergarten, walking beside her with a cartoon bear strapped to his shoulder as though it were armor. At night, he read stories until she fell asleep against his arm, then sat in the quiet, listening to her breathe, whispering the lullaby that had once lived only in memory. But there was more, something Evelyn's final whisper demanded of him. He could not stop with Elsie. He owed her legacy to more than just their child. And so, on the one-year anniversary of Evelyn's passing, Jonathan returned to the ballroom where everything began. This time it was not for polished elites or staged galas. It was for children. The chandeliers burned softer that night, there, golden glow falling upon patched dresses and scuffed shoes. Dozens of children filled the hall, orphans, foster kids, children who had felt invisible just like Elsie once had. Jonathan had created a foundation in Evelyn's name, pouring his fortune into scholarships, shelters, and hope. This was her legacy. The legacy died, and then, on that stage, stood Elsie. Her patched dress, now lovingly mended, swayed as she told their story. She spoke of the night she asked a stranger for just one dance. She spoke of how the man had knelt, not because he was weak, but because love had made him fall to his knees. She told them that no child is ever too small to be seen, too forgotten to be loved. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the hall, and not a single person remained unmoved. Tears streaked across faces both young and old, and then Elsie smiled shyly, extended her hand toward the audience, and whispered, "Can I have just one dance?" One by one, people rose, volunteers, donors, children without parents. The ballroom filled with pairs dancing slowly, awkwardly, beautifully, not for spectacle, not for wealth, for hope, for belonging. Jonathan stood at the edge of the stage, his chest aching, his throat tight. Elsie turned, her eyes finding his. She stepped down slowly, each movement graceful in its simplicity, until she stood before him. She held out her hand the same way she had that first night under the oak trees, ready, "Daddy." His knees trembled, his heart shattered and rebuilt. All at once, he took her hand, pulled her close, and whispered, "Always," and as they danced, not for a moment, not for a night, but for a forever Evelyn had given them, Jonathan understood the truth. He had not just been given a daughter, he had been given salvation. But salvation always comes with a price, and deep down, he feared that the empire he had abandoned would not remain silent forever. The empire did not remain silent. It never could. Jonathan Remington had built his fortune on power, precision, and control. And when he vanished from the public stage, the world noticed. Stock tickers flashed red. News anchors spoke in urgent tones about a CEO gone missing, a boardroom in crisis, a fortune hanging by a thread, rivals circled like wolves, ready to tear apart the legacy he had crafted brick by brick. His name filled headlines not with triumph, but with scandal. Where is Jonathan Remington? Who is the child seen at his side? But in the quiet of his home, where laughter began to echo down once hollow hallways, Jonathan didn't care. He poured orange juice into Elsie's cup, sat with her at the breakfast table, and listened as she told him about her new friend at school. Yet as the days passed, the pounding of fists at the gates of his empire grew louder. He knew the reckoning was coming. It arrived on a rainy morning. His board of directors convened in the marble conference room of Remington Tower. Their voices sharp, their patience gone. They demanded answers. The company had lost millions in his absence. Investors were pulling out, and competitors were seizing ground. For the first time, Jonathan entered that room not as an untouchable titan, but as a man transformed. They attacked him the moment he walked in. You've abandoned your responsibilities. The press is circling like vultures. Is it true? Jonathan, do you have a secret child? The words stung, but not in the way they expected. Jonathan stood at the head of the long glass table, his reflection staring back at him, older, worn, but steadier than it had ever been. He no longer needed the armor of arrogance. He had something stronger now. Yes, he said, his voice firm but calm. It's true. I have a daughter. Her name is Elsie, and she is not a secret. She is my future. Gasps rippled across the table. A few scoffed. One man slammed his palm against the glass. You've destroyed us with your recklessness. Jonathan's gaze hardened. No. I destroyed myself years ago when I forgot what mattered. I built towers and empires and left nothing inside them but dust. If that's what you want to cling to, do it without me. Silence. For the first time, his board saw not a CEO, but a man willing to burn his empire to the ground for the sake of one child in a patched dress. The meeting ended in chaos, but Jonathan walked away unshaken. The media storm grew fiercer. Headlines, screaming scandal, paparazzi waiting at his gates. But instead of hiding, he opened the doors. He called a press conference in the very ballroom where it all began. The cameras flashed like lightning as reporters shoved microphones toward him, questions flying like arrows. Jonathan stood tall at the podium, his hand resting on Elsie's shoulder. She wore her mended dress, her hair tied with a simple ribbon, her eyes unafraid. My name is Jonathan Remington, he began, his voice steady, echoing through the hall. I'd have been called many things: CEO, billionaire, mogul, but none of it mattered until the night a little girl asked me for just one dance. That girl is my daughter. For 5 years, I didn't know she existed. For 5 years, she carried my name without my presence. That ends today. She is my family. She is my forever. And no empire, no fortune, no headline will ever matter more than her. The room erupted with chaos. Some reporters sneered, others whispered. But the image of Jonathan kneeling to take his daughter's hand, guiding her into the center of the ballroom, silenced them all. He didn't care that cameras rolled. He didn't care that the world was watching. He cared only that Elsie smiled as she stepped onto his shoes once more, just as she had the first night. The music swelled, and together they danced, father and daughter, past and present, redemption and legacy. But the true shock came not from Jonathan, it came from Elsie. When the music ended, she looked out at the cameras, her small voice carrying with a clarity that pierced the chaos. Mommy said he might not come back, but he did, and he stayed, and he's my daddy now. The words, innocent and unpolished, struck harder than any corporate statement ever could. Tears glistened on faces in the crowd, headlines that had been sharpened, for scandal softened in real time.